Well, welcome everyone to the Eastside Freedom Library and our monthly labor history film evening. Tonight we have two guests to help us set a context for the film, Finally Got the News. I'm joined by David Colman, who is a professor in African American history at Ramapo College of New Jersey, and wrote a book called Race Against Liberalism, Black Workers and the UAW in Detroit, and James Robinson, whom hopefully some of you remember. James was with us a couple months back when we were looking at African American migration and reading his piece on dining car worker unionism. And James is a professor of ethnic studies at Metropolitan State University here in town. So, David, let me start with you. Do you want to give us a little bit of background to this organization, the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, who are the center of this film, which was made in 1970?
Absolutely, yeah. So the League of Revolutionary Black Workers really comes out of a longer tradition of autonomous organizing, race-based organizing among rank and file Black workers in the auto plants and in the UAW. And I would say, I think that's one thing the film doesn't focus as much on. You don't really get a sense of that in the film. I mean, the film does a lot of other great things, but one thing I think it doesn't show is how much organizing, independent organizing among Black workers starting since the founding of the UAW, starting with the Negro Caucus, it was called, in the 1940s, that fought against employment discrimination in the union, getting Black representation on the UAW executive board, to the National Negro Labor Conference Council, to the Trade Union Leadership Council. I mean, there were all sorts of efforts at a shop level, at the union local level, the international level, to get the UAW to focus on these issues of racism and making sure that Black workers had access to the same jobs, skill training, political positions of political power in the union. So when the in the 60s, then these caucuses kind of take a more radical turn, a more revolutionary turn, and are starting to get organized by a younger generation who weren't necessarily at the founding of the UAW in the 30s. They were more influenced by the kind of anti-colonial revolutions around the world, about the Black Power movement. So they started organizing new caucuses. One was called the Dodge Revolutionary Union Movement. And then if you were at the Eldon plant, it was the LRUM, the Eldon Revolutionary Union Movement. They even had spread outside of the auto plants to UPS, UPRUM. They had a chapter near where I am in New Jersey, in Mahwah. There was a Ford plant in Mahwah, and they had a chapter here. And then the League were kind of students, intellectuals who were trying to organize the activity of these revolutionary movements. And they formed a kind of cadre to coordinate this activity, connect it with the community, and kind of build for a larger revolutionary struggle.
Hey, James, do you think you could situate this in the history of the development of Black political thought in Detroit, and that provided intellectual materials that these workers could work with?
One of the I think interesting features of these young Black activists who did begin sort of the push for the League, for the Revolutionary Union movements, was the fact that many of them, or several of them at least, let me put it, were students at Wayne State University.
Yeah.
They were local kids from Detroit, who had, become aware of this larger movement, this Black movement, if you will, Black awareness movement that was going on around the country. And, they not only were students, but some of them, started a newspaper. The newspaper, I think it's called Inner City Voice, or became Inner City Voice. That was sort of a vehicle of communication among the workers and the community. But that, I think, was also a unique feature of the gestation of the League. that since they were community-based students, they definitely wanted to bring the community involvement into the struggles. Now that's my knowledge, and David, you can inform us better. I think that was not always, that was, having community involvement wasn't always a priority among everyone who was involved in the union or in the plants. So what I saw in the film, and I thought the film was really interesting as a work of art, was this sense of repoliticization of Black labor in Detroit, and that spread throughout the country in the mid 1960s, right? So that
absolutely.
So that these new Black workers, if you will, and I say that intentionally, because there is true evidence, and I made this point a couple of months ago when I spoke at the Eastside Freedom Library, that in the mid 60s, there is this definite transformation from being a Negro worker to being a Black worker. So Charles Denby, Indignant Heart, is initially subtitled, Notes from a Negro Worker. But in 1968, it becomes Notes of a Black Worker. James Boggs's work, was it American Revolution?
Yeah, a Negro Worker's Notebook.
Yes, is a Negro Worker's Notebook when it first comes out in the early 60s.
Right.
But in 1970, it's further notes from a Black worker's notebook. So this politicization, and I'm not saying Black power right now, because I think that was happening, but there was a larger ferment going on nationwide that crystallizes in Detroit in a very, very particular way around the activities of workers in the particularly in the automobile industry plants, that then spreads outward into the community and is in some ways inspired or ignited by the 1967 Detroit riot.
Yeah.
Right. Which then inflames, if you will, all of Detroit, but in particular, Black neighborhoods that were both the victims of decades of discrimination in housing and services, et cetera, and concomitant police brutality, and this burgeoning sense of racism in the plants and racism within the UAW. All of which seem to come together, to give fuel to the fire that became the League of Black Revolutionary Workers.
Right.
Can I?
Please, David.
I want to add. I think James' point is right on, and it's when you see the film, you'll see a point where they're chanting Black workers' power, right? It wasn't Black power, Black workers' power.
Yep.
And I think that gets to another element that's so fascinating to me about this film is the film was. It was initiated by Newsreel, the Newsreel Collective, kind of mostly white leftists in New York who came out to Detroit and were fascinated by this kind of industrial movement. And there was a lot of tension actually in the making of the film because the Newsreel crowd tended to have sympathies and alliances with the Black Panthers and the Weather Underground. And the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, when the film is being made, are actually in a very tense relationship with the Panthers in Detroit because the League of Revolutionary Black Workers didn't like all of the media celebrity attention that was starting to emerge around the left. This kind of vanguardism they thought, where just a few star leftists are going to lead people to the revolution. And one of the things that happens, the League kind of ends up taking over control of the film. And what you get is a film that's really, as James is saying, focused on the community, people, the masses, right? That you don't really get a sense of this is some celebrity, or, you know, in fact, the league was a little cautious about the film because they didn't want to come off like they were just looking for attention. But you really get a sense in the film that revolution, social change, justice is going to be something that ordinary people are going to accomplish through, you know, small acts of, you know, that build collectively.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and you know, the way in which Detroit as a city, you know, evolves or changes, you know, over the 20th century, or at least to this point of the 20th century, is also, I think, a factor in the ways in which you get a movement, almost a mass movement of workers, right? Because, you know, prior to the 1920s, the Black population in Detroit is pretty small.
Right.
You know?
Right.
And there is I think like a 400% some increase in the Black population in Detroit between 1920 and 1930, and then that doubles again between 1930 and 1940. And yet the old guard political establishment in Detroit, you know, is still there. And so this period in Detroit's history is one of increasing sort of demographic shift, but also increasing sense among, I think, the Black community of its powerlessness vis-a-vis the representative government. And that is mirrored in the labor movement, right? And so even though there are in the league, and there are Black leaders, you know, they are really they're insurgents. They're outside of the established labor movement, and really are, you know, kicking down the door and saying, no, we're here and we're here to stay. And I think, the interesting figure that emerges in some ways is Coleman Young, you know, who is sort of on the scene during this time of From and Drum, El Rum, you know, but he's not in the automobile plants.
Right.
Yeah.
But I, you know, it seems as if the impact of the league, you know, is one that leads to, you know, Coleman Young's eventual rise, you know, to political power as the mayor of Detroit.
Absolutely, and even some of the people he relies on have roots in the Negro Caucus of the 1940s, many of whom had associations with the Communist Party. And Coleman Young kind of lays low during the Cold War, you know, the 50s, and then, as you say, he comes back as this new movement emerging. Absolutely, yeah, he's an interesting figure.
So, David, you were saying before we started to record the conversation that the film found quite an audience in Italy.
Yeah, so
say a little bit about that.
Yeah, so the film, so eventually, actually, I think even before the film's finished, the newsreel folks kind of realized that they're not going to be able to finish it. The league is going to take it over. So the league kind of takes it over. There's some newsreel folks who stay, and then it gets a little bit of the league kind of splits for a variety of reasons, and the film gets a little bit of distribution on the West Coast. But what happens is John Watson, who's in the film, and an amazing figure, and you'll see, he ends up, I think he himself goes to Italy, or he makes connections with the Italian Communist Party, but also with the those extra paramilitary, like the Red Brigades, those factions that are emerging in Italy. The Italian Communist Party then would screen it, but from what I understand, they would try to kind of there's a lot of cursing in the film, and the Communist Party was a little reluctant to show that. Like, they were a little more conservative socially, but the Red Brigade kind of faction, the audience loved, you know, the language and the kind of flair of the movie, and they would see relationships with like Italian slang, and they, you know, so there was some kind of hesitancy among the Italian Communist Party about showing it just because of the language. But yeah, it ends up being quite popular there because of that. But I think because the film, the relationship between the League and newsreel kind of falls apart, it didn't get as widely distributed as it should have.
Right.
In the US. And yeah.
So before we turn to the film, I just want to explore one other area, and that is the shift in the US macroeconomy from Keynesianism to neoliberalism, and the impact that has had on manufacturing. And I think that at the time that this film was made, many people in progressive movements in the United States thought that this was the sort of the new expression of a radical labor movement, of a direction that the civil rights movement would be going in, both coming into the plants and coming from the plants out to the communities. And I remember I was in Pittsburgh in the mid-70s, and we were around the lawsuit that Black steelworkers filed with the NAACP against US Steel Company and the United Steelworkers Union, that they were the victims of decades of pattern of discrimination in hiring and promotion. And the result of that lawsuit was a consent decree that promised African-American workers that they would be on the ladder to greater job security and better jobs in the mills. And in fact, within 5 years, the mills began to close. And so it was a ladder going nowhere. And here we see a movement based in the auto plants, and the auto plants have basically disappeared. So what does this moment say to us now? We're in some people are saying we're in the largest expression of an anti-racist upsurge perhaps ever in the United States, certainly since the period of the late 60s. How are these historical periods connected? David, do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, I was actually thinking about that a lot watching the film again, and how prescient really the film is, and how timely. I mean, yeah, it's true. The deindustrialization has devastated, large parts of the country. But I mean, the League really was ahead of its time in terms of its focus on race and class. Right, that it's coming back now with the Bernie kind of the kind of resurgence of socialism, efforts to build the DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, and the popularity of Bernie Sanders, and efforts to kind of put workers and the working class front and center, but also address the issues of racism that have been so problematic in keeping the working class united in the country. I mean, the League, and you see this in the film too, was ahead of its time in terms of these questions about intersectionality. I mean, the League, and you see this in the film, was very aware about the particular way in which the system kind of shapes Black women's lives. And you don't see this in the film, but the League had a campaign in the plants against what they called forced dating, where Black women were kind of forced to date foremen or supervisors for jobs. And so they were very early on these issues of sexual harassment in the workplace, and issues that are still very much part of it. I mean, the League, one of their big efforts, actually, as James was pointing out with their community work, was fighting police brutality. And you see this in the film with the case of Danny Smith, a 9-year-old boy who was shot by the Highland Park police. But also, and you don't see this in the film, their work against stress, which was a kind of unit the Detroit police set up to attack, to kind of address armed robbery, but they ended up just assassinating a lot of mostly Black men in Detroit, and there was a lot of effort to stop that. I mean, even in terms of like, there's a scene, I don't know if, where there's a kind of, it's almost like a poem about capitalism, and you'll know when it comes on, but it's very much kind of early rap or spoken word. I mean, there's a cultural piece to the League that was there. So yeah, I think there's so many ways in which the League can really provide a model for going forward in this moment.
Great, great, thank you, James.
Well, and this gets back to, I think, touching on a point that Peter was trying to get at earlier, that the League, the leadership of the League collectively, not necessarily, or individually, not necessarily collectively, brought an analytical framework to both labor and civil rights that was focusing on the fact that most people work for a living. Black, white, brown, red, yellow, most people work for a living, and that within labor there are some social realities that cannot be denied, like some members of the white labor movement, if you will, would want to do, and that there were political priorities that these groups, Black, brown, red, yellow, laborers had to also be addressed. And I think some of that gets back to the intellectual environment that was around General Baker and Watson and Mike Hamlin and folk, that was created in part by someone like CLR James being there, someone like a James Boggs, James and Grace Boggs, Charles Denby, and others, who were a part of the local milieu, that especially these young men in the early phase of the formation of the revolutionary union movements, grew up in.
Yeah. Well, that's a great setting of the stage for us to watch this film. We should probably have a longer conversation at some point. But thank you both, James and David, for spending time with us. And
thanks for having me.
Yeah, great. And stay well. And
all right.
And we're going to roll the film. Thank you.